I've never been a huge fan of e-bikes, which I know is heresy, but for me, enjoyment on a bike has always been measured more in the time spent versus the miles covered. And 2 hours on a sharp handling trail or enduro bike has always felt better spent than 2 hours on a cumbersome e-bike. But this Devinci e-Troy Lite GX Axis build has done more than just nudge the needle. It may have made me a believer. So in light of that, I'm gonna do this review a little bit different. Instead of standing here and telling you about the bike, let's go out for a ride, and I'm gonna give you 5 reasons why this unlikely bike has earned itself a soft spot in my heart. As always though, I have included a link to this bike on 99spokes.com, so you can head over there at any point to look at all the geo numbers and part spec information that you want. Now though, let's get out on the trail. Now, I started getting on the bandwagon just a little bit with the advent of the lightweight E-MTB, but even then, for a long time, it seemed like you had to be willing to spend, close to $10,000 and get a carbon bike, and neither of those are things that I'm super thrilled on doing with my own money. Now, the e-Troy Lite was by no means the first alloy lightweight E-MTB to break that 20 kilogram or 45 pound mark, but it is still one of the few options available. My size large bike in the top tier GX Axis build weighed in at 43.6 pounds or 19.8 kilograms. The frame is also made in Canada, so it's pretty cool to have a North American made e-bike that again is just as affordable, if not an even better value than bikes that are made overseas. I'll talk about the geometry and suspension kinematics a little more later on, but a couple other features on the frame that I like are the clean internal cable routing that, yes, enters the frame on the head tube, not through the headset. It also features a clean little integrated chain guide and is UDH compatible. Well, we've made it to the fire road where I'm gonna be doing most of my climbing on this bike today. So I'm gonna go ahead and bump this up. I've been in the second highest mode. There are 4 power modes with this Bosch SX motor. Talk about it in a second, but I'm gonna bump up to 3 out of 4 and tell you a little bit more about the second reason why this bike has stolen my heart, and that's its value. Like I kind of alluded to a moment ago, one of the other big things that has turned me off when it comes to e-bikes is their price. And the e-Troy Lite isn't just more affordable than a lot of the competition, it's done so without cutting corners and, slapping a lot of low quality parts in the bike. And a good way to visualize this is by looking at the spec level comparison chart on 99spokes.com. As you can see, it's a bit of an outlier, with only a couple Aris besting it in terms of spec per price. And keep in mind that those are direct to consumer brands, whereas Devinci operates under a typical business to consumer model. So let's go ahead then and talk about some of the components that you're gonna find on this bike. As the name would imply, it gets SRAM's GX Access T-Type drivetrain. Unsurprisingly, there were no issues here, and to help keep weight down just a little bit, they've gone ahead and spec'd a pair of EXO cranks as well. Braking duties are taken care of by a pair of Magura MT5 brakes paired to 2 203mm rotors. They have a pretty predictable early bite point, which I like, but people who like a little more modulation might not be as big of fans. Devinci has really prioritized suspension performance with this bike, and regardless of what build tier you get, there's a good chance that you're gonna get higher quality suspension than a comparably spec'd lightweight E-MTB. This GX Access build gets a Lyric Ultimate fork with a Charger 3 damper delivering 160mm of travel, and a Super Deluxe Ultimate shock delivering 150 mils of travel. In terms of wheels and tires, you get the Raceface Arc 30 rims laced to some Raceface Vault hubs that have 120 points, or in other words, 3 degrees of engagement. So that's really nice to have that quick instant acceleration, especially when you couple that with a motor. Those are wrapped in a set of Maxxis tires. Up front is a 2.5-inch Maxxis DHF with the 3C Max Terra casing and EXO sidewalls. In the back is a Dissector, also 3C Max Terra, but it is EXO Plus. I think these tires are a good choice for this bike. We'll talk about geometry a little bit later on, and it does have a very slack head tube angle, but I would say it feels more like a trail bike than it does an enduro bike. And the DHF and Dissector have a great balance of fast rolling with grip, and honestly, I kind of like how the back tire breaks loose just a bit more easily than, say, a Assegai or even DHR2. It keeps things fun and exciting without being overly sketchy or scary. I'm not sure if I mentioned already, but this bike is exclusively a mullet, so 29 up front, 27.5 in the back. There is no flip chip or adjustment to go ahead and change that. Lastly, let's talk touch points. Get these nice Raceface Next carbon bars. You're also gonna get a 200mm, at least on the large and extra large, 200mm SDG dropper post. I've actually never ridden the SDG post before. Has a really nice light lever throw. And then of course you've got the Race Face Affect R stem as well. Well, we're getting to the top of this climb. I think it makes sense to go ahead and talk about reason number 3 that I've really enjoyed this bike, and that has to do with the Bosch Performance Line SX motor. This is one of the more powerful mid-drive motors, puts out 600 watts or 55 Newton meters of torque. And I actually had a chance to ride this bike alongside some other full power E-MTBs a few weeks ago, and it held its own pretty dang well. I did not have the 250 watt-hour range extender that Bosch makes, which meant that I had to choose between either working a little extra hard or not completing quite as many miles. But for the most part, I was able to keep up with those guys. And it helped that we were switching off bikes, so I wasn't on this one the whole time, but it really did hold its own. And that, again, leads into reason number 3, and that's that this motor makes this bike very adaptable. A 400 watt-hour battery is plenty long enough for a majority of my rides, but the fact that there is a range extender available means that you could use it and go out on much further excursions. And then the fact that you get 600 watts of power means that you can keep up with your friends on their full-size E-MTBs. I mentioned this earlier, but there are 4 power modes. I've mostly been hanging out in these 2 middle modes, but when you need the extra juice, this red power mode unlocks that full 600 watts, and like, yeah, you fly. In the lower 2 power modes, this bike is equally quiet as, say, like a Fazua or something like that, but up in these higher modes, it is a little bit noisier, especially at lower RPM. I found that this bike really likes to be ridden at a higher cadence. So if you're slow pedaling in this higher power, it gets pretty whiny. According to Devinci, in the mid power modes, this bike's gonna get an average range of about 2 hours, 40 kilometers, or 1,000 feet of climbing. As for me, I did a range test a little bit ago, ended up getting a little bit shy of that, but not too bad. I kind of had to go fishing to find things that I didn't like about the drive unit, but one thing I'd say is the display isn't the most sophisticated here. It'd be cool if, like on the TQ motors or Specialized bikes, you've got some displays that you can put through. Of course, Bosch does have an app that you can pull up on your phone and pull up all that data, but it's kind of nice when it's on the bike. Other than that though, no complaints about the Bosch Performance Line SX that this bike came with. All right, looks like we're getting to the descent. Drop this power down, the seat down. And I think it's time to talk a little bit about the 4th reason why I fell in love with this bike, and that is its handling, which once you're on single track, honestly doesn't feel much different than the analog bikes we're used to. I'm sure some of that comes down to weight, but I think a big part of it is the balance geometry and the really clear thought that's been put into the suspension kinematics. And let's go ahead and start there with the suspension. Devinci has used a split pivot design here, which is essentially a linkage-driven single pivot with an additional pivot around the rear axle that helps decouple braking forces. I said already, offers 150 millimeters of travel, and I would say that this bike feels more energetic than it does, plush, which I enjoy. It encourages a bit more of an engaged riding style, a bit more of an active riding style, but it's not gonna be quite as forgiving as some other 150, 160 mil bikes. One that comes to mind is like the Santa Cruz Heckler SL. Bike definitely feels a little bit bigger, despite having essentially the same travel numbers. Continuing on with the suspension, Devinci says that they've given this an e-bike specific tune. Essentially it means that they have decreased the anti-squat, so it's not as efficient of a pedaler. That doesn't really matter. Instead, you get more traction, which really does matter when you're putting down, 500 watts of power. Now, the other thing that, of course, aids in how intuitive this bike is to ride and how easy it is to get along with is its geometry. And that's highlighted by a pretty aggressive number, and that's a 63.6 degree head tube angle. But to be honest, it doesn't quite feel that slack. Like, if I were just to guess, I would think of it being more in like the, 64 range, like handles these tight switchbacks, no problem. But at the same time, it helps you get out of some more heinous situations for sure. The rest of the numbers aren't quite as extreme. Size large here has a 480 millimeter reach, and a 77.6 degree seat tube angle. And both seated and while standing, really just puts you in a pretty natural position. Doesn't feel all that much different than the majority of the trail bikes on the market. They're not trying to do anything crazy in that department, and I appreciate that. One number that is a bit more different than what a lot of brands are doing these days is Spec in this guy with some pretty short chainstays. They're 438 millimeters long, which I prefer. I like shorter chainstays on all my bikes, but I've kind of always had this theory that short chainstays and e-bikes are a good match because that shorter rear end actually kind of helps make the bike feel lighter. Makes it easier to get the front end up, and whether that's popping off of something or just maneuvering over, you know, square edged rock or something like that. Yeah, makes the bike feel just a tad lighter. Now, chainstay length on this bike does not change with size. So regardless of your size, you're getting those, which means on these bigger, you know, large and extra large frames, there's pretty big imbalance between front and rear triangle length. And I didn't experience this on this bike, but that could make for having a little more trouble weighting the front end. But again, nothing I experienced during my time with it. Overall then, I would describe the Lite as feeling more like a, I don't know, slightly longer travel trail bike than as a short travel enduro rig. I'm gonna talk about this more a little bit later on, but the bike that I've ridden recently that it reminds me the most of is the Specialized Turbo Levo SL. And that's a great thing. I really enjoyed that bike. And that brings me then to my fifth reason of why the Lite has helped me start to change my tune about e-bikes, and that's just that it's stinking fun. And I know I said at the start of the video that I've always measured my fun in hours and not miles, and the same thing applies, but I think we can all agree that it's more fun going down than it is going back up again. And with an e-bike, you do spend more time going down. But on a bike like the Lite, it doesn't feel like you're on a big old cumbersome sled. It feels like an agile trail bike when you're on single track like this. And I really enjoy that. Not only that, but you're not fretting about, you know, the $10,000 you just spent on your new e-bike. And if you wanted to go on some longer rides or go on rides with full power bikes, there's already a range extender out for this bike, and that's not something that can be said about a lot of these lightweight mid-power E-MTBs. Talking to you, Fazua, let's see that come out. And that just makes for a package that's really easy to live with, and again, a ton of fun. So I'm gonna go ahead and enjoy my way down the rest of this trail, and then I'll meet you in the parking lot to talk a little bit more about this bike and how it compares to other things on the market. Now that you've heard my thoughts on the bike, let's go ahead and talk about how it compares to some other similar bikes on the market. First is the Specialized Turbo Levo SL Comp Alloy, which lists for $7,000. That GX Access build of the Lite that I've been testing has a substantially higher spec pretty much across the board. Even still though, the Specialized is just 1.5 pounds or 0.7 kilograms heavier, which is almost exclusively due to its smaller 320 watt-hour battery. Both bikes also share the exclusive mixed wheel setup, as well as 150 millimeters of travel in the back and 160 up front. In terms of geometry, the Specialized is a good bit sportier, with a full degree steeper head tube angle, as well as a shorter reach and shorter chainstays across all sizes. Before spending time on the Devinci, the Turbo Levo SL is probably what I would have said is my favorite E-MTB. It's poppy, agile, and encourages a more playful approach to riding. But I think the Lite does all of that with the added versatility of a bigger battery, more powerful motor, and a bit more composure when things get rough. Not to mention the fact that it's a significantly better value when you look at the cost and the components that you're getting. So in this case, the Lite is the pretty clear winner for me. But the next comparison isn't quite so cut and dry, and that is with the Cannondale Moterra Nia SL2. This bike made quite a bit of noise when it came out a few months ago because it was the first full power E-MTB to be less than 45 pounds or 20 kilograms. And it does that with Shimano's EP801 motor paired to a 601 watt-hour battery. Because of that, the Cannondale obviously is going to have more range as well as more assistance. Now, in terms of part spec, the Devinci is once again going to come out on top, mostly because Cannondale did have to cut back a little bit to compensate for the carbon frame, but there's nothing on that Moterra Neo SL2 that I would have any issue going out and riding. In terms of on-trail performance, I actually had the opportunity to do some back-to-back testing with both of them while at the Northwest Tune-Up a couple weeks ago. On the way up, of course, the power is very noticeable. And on the way back down, the Cannondale feels like quite a bit bigger bike, despite weighing only a little bit more. I'm guessing this mostly comes down to the larger 29-inch wheel on the back, super slack 62.5-degree head tube angle, and long 453mm chainstays. Personally, as I've already said, I do prefer that more slightly poppier, more agile feel that the Devinci had, but that's not to say that there aren't folks out there who will appreciate the more planted and secure feeling Cannondale. At the end of the day, the Devinci e-Troy Lite is a breath of fresh air for folks like myself who have been a bit reluctant to get on the E-MTB train. The suspension kinematics and geometry made it feel like the analog bikes that we love. The Bosch SX drive system performed flawlessly, I've never had an issue with it, and the part spec for the price is pretty dang impressive. Now, you wrap all that up in an aluminum frame that was made in Canada and still weighs right around 43 pounds, and it's a recipe for success. If you have any more questions about the Devinci e-Troy Lite, then you can go ahead and drop those in the comments and I'll be sure to answer them. Another way you can get more information on the bike is by going to 99spokes.com, and again, I do have a link for that in the description. Thanks for tuning in to another 99 Spokes review. As always, remember that bikes are for everyone. Have fun out there.